AITA for refusing to attend my sister's wedding because my wife wasn't invited? Weddings are supposed to be joyous occasions, right? A time when family comes together, where past differences fade away, and you celebrate love and unity. But somehow my sister Rachel's wedding has turned into the most stressful, divisive thing I've ever faced. I, 32M, always thought that Rachel, 28F, and I had a strong bond, one that would survive anything. But now, it feels like the ground beneath me is shifting, and I don't know where I stand with her or with my own family. Rachel and I grew up close. When we were kids, our parents went through a bitter divorce. Rachel was only 8 at the time, and I was 12, old enough to understand more than I should have. Our parents' arguments became the soundtrack to our childhood, filling the house with tension. Rachel would hide in her room, covering her ears with her hands, and I tried to distract her with games or stories. I took on the role of protector, the big brother who would shield her from the worst of it. I remember promising her once, after a particularly bad night, that I'd always look out for her, no matter what. I'm in it then, and I'm in it for a long time. But time changes things. After the divorce, our mom got full custody, and our dad drifted away. He would send birthday cards and call occasionally, but the distance was always there. Rachel and I had to grow up faster than most kids, learning to rely on each other and on our mom. Our teenage years were marked by the usual sibling squabbles, but we always made up, always stuck together. When Rachel started dating Kevin, 30M, in college, I was thrilled for her. He seemed like a solid guy, someone who made her laugh and brought out a more carefree side of her that I hadn't seen since we were kids. They dated for years, and while I wouldn't say Kevin and I became best friends, we got along well enough. When he proposed to Rachel, I was genuinely happy for them. I thought their wedding would be a chance for our family to come together in a way we hadn't in a long time. Around the time Rachel met Kevin, I met Sarah, 30F, who would become my wife. Sarah was, and still is, everything I could have hoped for in a partner. We met at a friend's party, and from the moment we started talking, I knew she was special. She has this warmth that just draws people in, but she's also fiercely intelligent and can hold her own in any debate. It wasn't long before I introduced her to Rachel, hoping they'd become friends too. Their first meeting was okay. Rachel was polite, but there was an awkwardness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Sarah, always eager to make connections, tried to engage Rachel in conversation, but Rachel's answers were short, and she kept glancing at her phone. Sarah brushed it off, saying it was probably just nerves or a bad day, and I wanted to believe that was the case. But over the years, it became clear that Rachel just didn't like Sarah. There were little things that made me wonder if I was imagining it. Sarah would invite Rachel out for coffee, and Rachel would always have an excuse. She was too busy, or she'd already made plans. At family gatherings, Sarah would try to include Rachel in conversations, but Rachel would find a way to shift the focus away from Sarah. When we got married 6 years ago, Rachel was a bridesmaid, but her enthusiasm seemed forced. She smiled for the photos, but behind the scenes, she barely spoke to Sarah. At the time, I chalked it up to Rachel's introverted nature. She'd always been a bit reserved, especially around new people. I figured that she just needed more time to warm up to Sarah, and I hoped that once she got to know her better, things would improve. But they never did. Sarah, to her credit, tried not to let it bother her too much. She would say, "I get that I'm not everyone's cup of tea, and that's fine. I just want to be respectful and keep things friendly," but I could see the hurt in her eyes whenever Rachel brushed her off. I'd reassure her that Rachel would come around eventually, but I was starting to lose faith in that myself. Then came Rachel's engagement to Kevin. When she called me to share the news, her voice was brimming with excitement. She talked about how Kevin had proposed during a weekend getaway, how she'd cried and said yes, and how they were already planning the wedding. I listened and shared in her joy, thinking that maybe this wedding would be a chance to mend the rift between her and Sarah. Maybe seeing us all come together for her big day would soften whatever walls she'd built up. But then the invitations went out and everything changed. I was at work when I got a text from Sarah. It was a photo of the invitation Rachel had sent us, addressed only to me. "Only you?" Sarah's message read, with a question mark that felt like it had 100 layers of emotion behind it. Confusion, hurt, disappointment. I stared at the screen, try to understand what I was looking at. Why hadn't Rachel invited Sarah? I texted Rachel, thinking it had to be a mistake. But her reply was immediate and curt. It's not a mistake. I didn't invite her. I hope you understand. I didn't understand at all. I called her, hoping to get a better explanation, but the conversation went south quickly. Rachel's tone was defensive from the start, like she'd been expecting me to argue with her. She kept repeating that it was her wedding, her choice, and that she didn't want Sarah there because Sarah made her uncomfortable. What do you mean, uncomfortable? I pressed, feeling a tight knot form in my chest. Sarah's done nothing but try to be nice to you, Rachel. She's tried to be your friend. What has she done that makes you uncomfortable? But Rachel refused to give me a straight answer. She just kept saying things like, you wouldn't get it, or this is about me, not her. The more I pushed, the angrier she got, until she finally snapped. Mark, if you really love me as your sister, you'll respect my decision. It's my day. I don't want her there. I was so stunned that I didn't know what to say. I ended up hanging up, feeling like my world had just tilted off its axis. I couldn't believe that Rachel would exclude Sarah like this, with no real explanation. I drove home that night, my mind racing, dreading the conversation I'd have to have with Sarah. When I got home, Sarah was sitting on the couch, waiting for me. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see the hope in her eyes, like she was praying I'd tell her that it was all a big misunderstanding. But when I told her what Rachel had said, I watched that hope crumble. Sarah tried to put on a brave face, but I could see her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I just don't understand, Mark, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I thought we were past all this. I've tried so hard to make things right with her. I don't understand either, I admitted, feeling my own frustration boiling over. But I'm not going without you. If she won't invite you, then I'm not going. It's not fair, and I'm not going to leave you behind. Sarah looked at me, her expression a mix of gratitude and pain. Are you sure? She's your sister. I don't want to be the reason you miss her wedding. You're not the reason, I said firmly. Rachel is, and I'm not going to let her treat you like this. Over the next few days, I tried talking to Rachel again, hoping to find some common ground, some way to fix things. I told her that she was putting me in an impossible position, that she was asking me to choose between my wife and my sister, and that it wasn't fair. But every time, she shut me down, insisting that it was her wedding, her choice. She said she deserved to have things exactly the way she wanted, and if I really cared about her, I'd just accept it. The tension between us kept building, and eventually Rachel brought my parents into it. My mom called me one evening, saying that she and Dad wanted to talk. I knew it wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation, but I went over to their house anyway, hoping that maybe they'd understand my side. But when I got there, I realized that Rachel had already laid the groundwork. My parents sat me down in the living room, and my mom started talking about how weddings were about family and making memories. She said Rachel was under a lot of stress, and that I should be more understanding of her wishes. My dad chimed in, saying that Sarah would understand if I went without her, that it was just one day and I shouldn't make it into a bigger deal than it needed to be. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're seriously asking me to abandon my wife? I asked, my voice rising. You think that's something Sarah should just be okay with? My mom gave me a sympathetic look, but it felt more condescending than anything else. Mark, we just want to keep the peace. You know how sensitive Rachel is. We don't want any drama. I laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. You think this isn't drama? Excluding my wife is the most dramatic thing Rachel could have done. And instead of telling her she's being unreasonable, you're backing her up? My dad's face hardened. Son, this isn't about taking sides. It's about making sure Rachel's wedding is special for her. You can't ruin this for her. I felt like I was losing my mind. I'm not trying to ruin anything. I just want my wife to be treated like part of the family. Why is that so hard for you all to understand? The conversation went in circles until Rachel showed up, looking smug, like she'd already won. So, have you decided to come? She asked, her voice casual, as if the past few weeks of fighting hadn't happened. I looked her in the eye, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. No, I haven't. Because unless Sarah's invited too, I'm not coming. Her expression twisted into something cold and hard. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. Do whatever you want. But don't blame me if this ruins our relationship. My heart felt like it was breaking. Rachel, I don't want to ruin anything. But you're the one making this choice. You're the one pushing me away. Rachel just crossed her arms, glaring at me. She's not my family, Mark, and she never will be. Her words hit me like a physical blow. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but I knew there was no point in arguing anymore. Well, then, I guess you made your choice, I said quietly. I'm sorry it had to be this way. I walked out of my parents' house that night, feeling like a chapter of my life had just closed forever. As I drove home, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. I thought about all the memories Rachel and I shared, all the times we'd been there for each other, and I wondered if any of it had ever meant as much to her as it had to me. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me, and as soon as I told her what Rachel had said, she pulled me into a tight hug. You don't have to do this, Mark, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You don't have to sacrifice your family for me. I hugged her back, feeling the weight of everything I'd been holding and finally break free. You are my family, I said, my voice cracking. You're the only one who's ever really been there for me. And I'm not going to let anyone take that away from us. The wedding went on without us, and word got back to me through a few friends that Rachel wasn't happy about it. She told everyone that I had abandoned her on her special day, making herself out to be the victim. My parents stopped by our house a few times, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I just wasn't ready to hear more about how I'd let them all down. For a while, it felt like my life had become two parallel worlds, the one I had with Sarah and the one that existed with my family. My phone was full of missed calls and unread messages from my mom, Rachel, and even a few mutual friends who wanted to give me their 2 cents. I wasn't ready to hear any of it. Sarah did her best to keep my spirits up. She made my favorite meals, planned small-day trips, and encouraged me to focus on the hobbies I'd always put off. She never said it, but I could see the worry in her eyes, the way she'd glance over at me when she thought I wasn't looking. She was trying so hard to make me feel okay, even though I knew she blamed herself for the whole mess, no matter how many times I told her it wasn't her fault. The silence from my family eventually broke on a Saturday afternoon, about 2 weeks after the wedding. Sarah was out running errands, and I was sitting on the couch, trying to get into a movie when there was a knock at the door. I ignored it at first, figuring it was just a neighbor or someone trying to sell something. But then I heard a familiar voice through the door. Mark, I know you're in there. It was my mother. I froze, torn between the urge to keep pretending I wasn't home and the guilt that came with knowing my own mother was standing outside in the cold. I got up, walked to the door, and cracked it open, just enough to see her standing there with a sad, hopeful expression on her face. Her hands were wrapped around a large Tupperware container. Some kind of peace offering, I guessed. Mom, what are you doing here? I asked, my voice sounding more tired than I'd meant it to. She looked down at the container, as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. I made lasagna, she said, trying to smile. Your favorite. I wanted to feel touched by the gesture, but all I felt was a dull ache in my chest. It was like she thought a homemade meal could somehow make up for everything that had happened. I don't know if this is a good time, I said, my hands still gripping the edge of the door. Mark, please. Can we just talk for a minute? She pleaded, her voice cracking. I know you're angry, but I just want to understand what's going on. We haven't spoken in weeks, and I sighed and opened the door wider. Fine, Mom. Come in. But I'm not promising anything. She stepped inside, looking around like she hadn't seen the place 1,000 times before. I took the lasagna from her and put it on the kitchen counter, then gestured for her to sit on the couch. She perched on the edge, hands folded in her lap, as if she were bracing herself for whatever I was about to say. I sat across from her, arms crossed, waiting for her to start. She took a deep breath and said, Your sister's been really upset, you know. She keeps saying she doesn't understand why you wouldn't just come to the wedding. She thinks you don't care about her anymore. I let out a bitter laugh. That's rich coming from her. She's the one who made it clear that she didn't consider Sarah part of the family. She's the one who put me in this position, Mom. Not me. My mother's face crumpled a little, like she'd expected me to be more forgiving. Rachel was hurt, Mark. You know she's always had a hard time expressing herself, but she really thought you'd be there for her. I felt a surge of anger flare up inside me, hot and sharp. I tried to be there for her, but not on her terms. She expected me to just leave my wife at home like some dirty secret. How can you not see how wrong that is? My mom's eyes darted away, and for a second I thought she might actually acknowledge it. But then she shook her head, her expression turning frustrated. Your father, and I think you're being stubborn. We think you're throwing away years of a relationship with your sister over one decision. I leaned forward, my hands clenched into fists. It's not just about the wedding, Mom. It's about the fact that Rachel has never tried to accept Sarah. It's about her acting like Sarah is some kind of outsider when she's been my wife for 6 years. How long am I supposed to wait for Rachel to grow up? My mom's face softened, but she still didn't seem to get it. Your sister feels like Sarah is taking you away from us. She's always felt that way, but she doesn't know how to say it. She thinks she's lost her big brother, and she's hurting. Yeah? Well, maybe she's not the only one who's hurting, I shot back. Maybe I've been hurting for years, watching the way she treats Sarah like she's some kind of invader. And I'm done with it, Mom. I'm done trying to make peace when Rachel's the one who keeps making war. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. My mom's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands. You know, your dad wanted me to say that we'll always be here for you, no matter what. But I hope you know that it's not too late to fix things with Rachel. It doesn't have to end like this. I stared at her, feeling a knot of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite name tightening in my chest. I didn't make this choice lightly, Mom. I love Rachel, but I can't keep sacrificing my wife's dignity for her insecurities. If Rachel wants to be in my life, she's going to have to accept Sarah. That's the bottom line. My mom didn't say anything to that. She just nodded slowly, like she'd finally realized she wasn't going to change my mind, and got up to leave. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness, like I'd closed a door I wasn't sure would ever open again. For the next few weeks, things were quiet, too quiet. It was like my entire family had gone radio silent, and I was left in this uneasy limbo, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then, one evening, Sarah and I were out to dinner with some friends when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a mutual friend who'd been at the wedding, someone who'd always had a bit of a gossip streak. You won't believe what Rachel said about you during the speeches. I stared at the message for a moment, dread curling in my stomach, before I excused myself and stepped outside to read the rest of it. The friend went on to describe how Rachel, in the middle of her reception, had given a speech where she'd talked about the importance of loyalty and how some people forget where they come from when they get married. She'd said that she wished certain family members could have been there, but that she understood that some people choose their own lives over family. Reading those words felt like being doused in cold water. She hadn't just excluded Sarah from the wedding. She'd taken the opportunity to publicly frame me as the villain in her story. It was like she was rewriting the narrative in front of all her guests, turning herself into the wounded sister and me into the selfish brother who'd turned his back on her. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to storm over to her place and confront her, to demand that she explain herself. But as I stood there in the cold, the wind cutting through my jacket, all I felt was a deep, aching sense of loss. This wasn't the sister I thought I knew, the sister I'd protected all those years ago. This was someone who was willing to tear me down just to make herself feel better. When I went back inside, Sarah looked up at me, concerned. Everything okay? I forced a smile, even though I knew she could see right through it. Yeah, just some drama from Rachel. She squeezed my hand under the table, her expression softening. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but you don't have to deal with it alone either. I felt a lump rise in my throat, and I nodded, grateful beyond words for her support. I'll tell you later, I promised. Let's just enjoy tonight. Eventually, the holidays rolled around, bringing with them a whole new set of challenges. Christmas had always been a big deal in our family, decorating the tree, watching cheesy holiday movies, and spending hours around the dinner table reminiscing about old memories. But this year, the thought of going back to my parents' house filled me with dread. I wasn't sure how I'd handle seeing Rachel again, knowing what she'd said about me at her wedding, knowing that she still saw herself as the victim. TLDR, my sister invited me to her wedding, but excluded my wife, saying that my wife made her uncomfortable without giving any real explanation. I refused to attend without my wife, leading to a huge family argument where my parents sided with my sister, urging me to go alone to keep the peace. My sister said that my wife would never be part of her family, and I walked away, knowing I had to stand by my wife. The wedding happened without us, and my family is still upset, but I'm learning to live with the choice I made to support my marriage.